All right. Thank you everyone for joining. We're going to get started. We have a pretty packed agenda today, so I want to make sure we're taking advantage of the time. Really appreciate everyone making time for us today and joining our 5th webinar of the Train and Build webinar series. For those of you that are curious about the other webinars that we've done as part of the series, we do have those saved on our website, so you can go back and review the previous sessions that we did. Today we're going to be talking about navigating the critical path, looking at expert strategies for efficient study startup and oversight. And just to start with some quick introductions, my name is Nicole Bruecker. I am a senior director here at Elevate Clinical Research Solutions. I've been in research for about a decade, mostly on the site side, mostly in startup, but I've also worked in other positions as well, including on the CRO side.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sonia Abrol, and I'm Chief Product Officer and partner at ECRS, and I oversee the product strategy and the solutions and services we provide. I've spent a major part of my career building out site solutions such as clinical trials management systems, biospecimen management systems, EDC, and so on. And for over 25 years, worked with a lot of AMCs, research sites, networks, and cancer centers to lead their implementations as well as their interoperability infrastructure using such solutions. Very nice to be here today. Thank you.
All right, so we're really excited to have Sonia here with us. Today we're going to be talking about common issues in study startup and looking at them from both a process perspective, so sort of more my area of expertise, and then looking at the technology tool side of thing, having Sonia, share her expertise on those considerations. We should have time at the end for Q&A. There is a chat box that you can use to submit questions to us, so we'll try to get through as many of them as we can at the end of the session. And just in terms of quick company backgrounds, just to kind of talk about sort of the lens in which we're having this conversation today. So Elevate Clinical Research Solutions, we partner with sites. Our kind of main goal is to provide a dedicated site expert to the sites that we work with. Not only bringing expertise, but really having that close relationship with sites in terms of doing things in a very, site-specific way, understanding sites' goals, and making sure that we're delivering in a way that is truly a customized solution. In terms of the services that we work on, so we work on the standard startup services, we do CAs, budgets, contracts, CTMS, but we also have some specialty services, including train and build, which is, the lens that we're using for this webinar series, which is just a site customized training solution that we provide. Revenue protection, which is our AR service, and then we do staffing as well.
Hi, so ECRS is a technology product and services company. We have 2 purpose-built products. One is TrialConnx, which is designed for helping manage all study startup activities from all the way from pre-award to study startup and provide the much needed oversight to sites and research institutions using it for their startup management. And the other product is Navonco, which is again purpose-built for streamlining all community outreach and engagement activities cancer centers and research sites perform. We also provide digital solutions, digital health solutions, data integrations, and interoperability solutions, as well as clinical research management and implementation services as well.
All right. And just a little bit in terms of why and how Sonia are here together talking about this topic. So we actually used to work together in different areas of a previous company. And when kind of starting with Elevate, we were looking at having something in place to manage our own workload. So in terms of being able to have a centralized area and making sure that we're being as efficient and organized as we can and centralizing kind of key parts of what we do. That's kind of where we're looking for a platform for that. Sonia has, a great offering here in terms of TrialConnx. We're using it in a slightly unique way in terms of how sites are typically using it versus kind of our partnership. But a lot of the core elements and a lot of what we're talking about today actually is sort of around the value of having a centralized system where we can really build in the efficiency with our processes using the tool TrialConnx. So we are using that internally, but kind of the unique thing that we have as a company is we use it with our clients as well. So it's something that we provide free to our clients. It's a little bit of a unique view that they get versus kind of our own internal view that we use for our own study management. But it's something that allows the sites that we work with to see study status in real time, get information about metrics. It can be used to communicate with us, to view all the documents for the trials and services that we work on, and actually coming soon, submitting requests to us directly to work on the studies. So that's kind of the background in terms of kind of our partnership and kind of where we're collaborating and why we wanted to work together on this webinar today. So like I mentioned, we're kind of stepping back and looking at study startup kind of more high level and talking about kind of the process and technology considerations as it relates to study startup. So to kick that off, we're kind of looking at the issues first to lay the foundations for this conversation, focusing on the different bottlenecks that are common, and then we'll kind of work through different considerations and potential solutions to the items that we're talking about here. So as part of study startup bottlenecks, so of course, right away talking about negotiations and the bottlenecks that happen there as a common area where issues occur as part of study startup process and where there's can be significant slowdowns, whether that's related to handoffs, just the general workflow that your site might have. Of course, there's the sponsor CRO aspect to that in terms of are they being communicative with you? What does their process look like? What are they requiring of you in terms of justification, escalations, trying to schedule calls with them, as required to push things along. A note that I have here just kind of as it relates to the issue, but this will be kind of more discussed on the solution side of things in terms of expectation setting. So internally, externally, what are your goals for your negotiations as it relates to your overall activation timeline, and just kind of workload management in general. So there's, the complication of the negotiations for each study, but of course, most sites have multiple studies going on at one time. So when you're looking at kind of your site's process and workflows and where things are getting stuck in the process today, another part of that is kind of looking even more high level at all the studies that you may have in terms of kind of process considerations.
Yeah, and in addition to the process issues, lack of having good technology solutions to assist with the whole budget negotiation and contract negotiation process certainly adds to the timeline of the whole conduct. And some challenges may include how do you navigate through those complex budget designs and different templates sponsors may come up with. How do you trace the communication going back and forth between the sponsors and your own teams and then internally other teams as well? And can you follow through the complete process at one single place? And often sites are struggling to find data at different places or find information at different places, and they have to even manually work through the routing process of the documentation, follow up through the communication as well as the negotiation process. And that everything adds up to the timeline and poses the barriers that we see in slowdown.
So kind of the next sub point here in terms of bottlenecks. So of course there's the regulatory aspect of everything, and the impact of that is much greater than what's outlined here. We kind of focused on, our experiences working with sites from each of our companies and kind of where we specialize. But, of course, beyond this, there's, if you're working with a centralized IRB and or having to do local as well, all the document management, everything that comes with that. But in terms of, the different startup services outside of regulatory, ICF cost language is a area where, as an example, making sure that the budget language is reflected in the ICF. So what does that look like in terms of your process and when are you submitting that for approval? And then, as it relates to CA, just the general regulations with Medicare, and kind of the, potential bottleneck here being anything that's gray. So anything that would require a site decision, potential escalation, and what does that look like?
Yeah, and navigating this whole landscape in general produces plenty of technology challenges as well. And there are quite a lot, but I'll mention a few. The first one would be the data management and the interoperability of that data. So we are talking about your internal review boards, internal IRBs, external IRBs, or external services that you may go for. And then the whole bunch of different submission requirements based on the type of study you're doing, the type of where you're doing the study, and so on. And oftentimes there are multiple systems in place. Sometimes the systems are old, they will not exchange information that easily as well. And sometimes some of those internal reviews are done on paper-based, spreadsheet-based systems as well, which really don't offer much opportunity for integrations. The second challenge would be the document management and compliance of the documentation requirements as well. And again, region specific, country specific, whatever documentation requirements there are, through the submission process, through the entire getting the approval process, there is a lot of, again, back and forth, and managing the huge volume of documentation depending on the study volume also poses different challenges. Third one I'll mention is a lack of automation or workflow automation tools that can help team members guide through the process. Not everybody adopts one. Most people don't even know such things exist, and that leads to a lot of inconsistencies as teams navigate through the whole submission process internally and externally. They have to manually trace where things are or manually route things, and there are bottlenecks that sometimes will delay the process as a result, and of course ultimately leads to a slower progress of the study startup.
Okay, so continuing on in terms of other bottlenecks, so kind of tying to a lot of those points is the document management process. So just document management in general. So kind of with the initial documents and going through that process, and what does approval look like, and how are you working through the documents, but also, of course, when things get even more complicated, such as protocol amendments. So if you have an oncology trial, and let's say this is protocol amendment number 10, because that does happen, how are you making sure that all the necessary updates are going down the process, that the necessary people are informed, that understanding sort of which documents apply during what period, when is the coverage analysis effective in terms of the documents, and kind of working through that in terms of the process side of things.
Yeah, and from the technology side, I'll piggyback on the same. Yes, there are challenges in general process-wise, but the challenge here from technology would be, how do you tie the whole document management, tie it with your startup process? So rather than, yes, you're depending on SharePoints and Google Drives and other central drives where the documents are sitting, but they are sitting separately, and you are working through the whole startup separately as well, disjointed teams, disjointed systems, and it's hard to tie it unless somebody is spending time to say, yes, with this activity, these are the versions we went through and these are the documents we have, and so on. So that itself brings in that time that's required to get through the process. The team members are literally left to connect the dots as they go through the process.
So the next bottleneck we have is around communication, and I would say kind of probably the two main things that I'll be talking about throughout is communication and then documentation in terms of addressing these bottlenecks. Probably goes without saying that those are the two keys probably to trying to find the efficiencies in this process and speeding things up. And communication, of course, is both internal and external. So what does that look like between all the different members of your team? What does that look like between you and the CRO and the sponsor? How are you managing that? How are you kind of staying on top of that? Is there, additional steps in your communication process that maybe are unnecessary in terms of approval escalation, needing to find more information that should be available? Kind of zoning in on the different aspects of the communication and how that can slow down or impede progress.
Great point. And while there are multiple stakeholders to work with, teams are also using various ways to communicate, so that there is no lack of technology in how people are communicating these days. The problem is the technology doesn't tie it very nicely with the whole startup process. So for anybody to go in and see, yes, we were working on this particular work stream or activity for the startup, can you find everything possibly that went down through beginning to end of that particular activity? And that's what you would spend more time if it comes to it, and see where could be the breakdown, where could be the slowdown as they worked on one certain activity. And all of this leads to actually more people dependency. People will be attending meetings, sitting in meetings to find out what are their next steps, because they don't want to again rely on the emails that they may be coming, the 200 emails that they'll miss during that day.
Okay, a couple more just to lay out all the issues because we haven't talked about enough already. So resources and staffing, of course, are a really major one. You can have all the processes, all the communication, all the tools in place, but really this all comes down to your people, and bringing in the right people and training them in a helpful manner that's not only comprehensive to what they're doing, but then specific to your site. And this is really kind of the where the train and build kind of came into existence, really, is having this conversation with sites about, one, we work in a niche industry and we're finding a niche within a niche in terms of people that can do these services and the challenges that come with that. And actually our last webinar that we did, we covered this kind of a lot more in detail. So if you're kind of curious about the different considerations there, we really kind of deep dove into that. But just kind of thinking through again, what are your needs in terms of FTE? Do you need a hybrid solution where you're also partnering with a vendor? Is it more cost effective and brings in expertise to bring in a vendor just entirely? If you are going to do it internally, do you have the right tools and resources available to sufficiently train them, not only initially, but just on an ongoing basis, and making sure that they have what they need to be successful? Because you can bring in the best of person, but if they don't have the right tools, you're going to run into issues in terms of the process.
That's a great point. And yes, there is shortage of resources. Sites are facing budget cuts, and people are expected to do more with less. Now, if they don't have the right tools, definitely that's it. People are hardly able to keep their head above water here. They're working off of maybe the emails and the phone calls and spreadsheets and whatnot. And any purpose-built technology, if they can bring along to help resources organize themselves, give them the clarity and the visibility they need to produce the work they're supposed to produce, will definitely bring in the much needed efficiency, and also control that the individual or the resources may need to have over the work they are performing, as well as the other stakeholders.
All right, final point here. So just in terms of technology integration, so of course this is more of a Sonia point than mine, but I think the process consideration here is, I think the challenge is a lot of times for a site, you're working with a different reg tool, a different CTMS, a different invoicing tool. Maybe your CAs are Excel. So there's a lot of different areas that you're working on in terms of potential bottlenecks with that. What is the workflow? What is the source of truth if you have different iterations of the same thing in different locations, and just kind of thinking through that aspect of things.
Yeah, and when it comes to technology, I would say there are two different types of challenges. One is a low tech or a no tech site. You're totally relying on manual processes, maybe for startup and some of the other ongoing activities as well. And of course, the right technology can help expedite how you are running through your startup process. But then there is also a technology overload that we've all been seeing for last few years. The more number of sponsors a site starts working with, the number of logins they have to remember, or the number of systems they have to learn, also continue to increase as well. And the biggest headache is if you are dependent on workflows which are very manual, or the systems that really don't talk to each other. That's where you're looking at a lot of manual data entry or double data entry, more errors, and of course, more time wasted.
Okay, so that was kind of a long list of the bottlenecks, just to kind of again sort of set the stage for the rest of this conversation here in terms of all of the different considerations, all of the different things that can impede the efficiency of startup. And now we're going to kind of work through some of this. So next, we're kind of talking about just building a strong foundation and trying to be as proactive in the planning as you can. I think this is another area where, in terms of train and build, it's something that we talk to sites a lot about, and the other kind of thinking behind providing this service is it's sort of the thing sites would do if they had the time to do it themselves. So it's not, sometimes it's expertise, but sometimes it's just, kind of doing the right things that are going to set you up for a strong process and to have efficient quality processes in place. It does take an initial investment of time. So documented plans. So I think this is, beyond key in terms of having a strong process in place. But it does, ideally require engagement from key stakeholders. So, making sure that you're bringing in the right people into the conversation, including, individual contributors in terms of, what's their kind of pain points, where are their opportunities, how can you try to, include their current processes or be thoughtful about that as you're mapping things out and as you're mapping out your workflow and where there's opportunities to try to address these pain points. In terms of documented plan, I have kind of here too as well, using the CA as the starting point. Again, kind of thinking high level and how everything is impacted by the CA. This is something that I could talk about quite a bit, but just in terms of kind of thinking through the overall process and really being thoughtful in terms of the significant impact that the CA has as a starting point. But beyond that, just in terms of general resources and tools that might be helpful to consider as a site. So communication plans, going back to the point of bottlenecks about, escalations, approvals, handoffs. There's lots of situations where where items can get stuck in the process, where maybe you're requiring a additional step that might not be necessary, or it's only necessary in some cases, but it's just part of the process today, and you kind of haven't had the time to sit and think through that. So actually going through that process of what does that look like and what, who needs to be involved when, and kind of mapping that out, along with, of course, playbooks. So most sites I would say that we work with have a CTA playbook, but ideally, coverage analysis playbook, budget playbook, your CTMS, the more that you can have documented, again, as a tool available to your team to be able to do these items well, to maintain the quality, to maintain the consistency. If you're bringing in someone new, if they have tools and information available, you still, of course, want to provide great training, but the more that they can have that they'll kind of commonly encounter, then that way they're not having to chase down other people all the time to get more information that could be just made available to them.
Yeah, great points. And from my side, I was more thinking towards a documented plan of your whole startup process, beginning to end. And as you mentioned, there may be things that are getting done because just you doing so, it may or may not apply to a certain type of study. So having an organized system that can give you the visibility, this is how it looks like when you're running an industry study, and this is how it looks like when you're running a non-industry study, and something to guide you through the whole process and give you an organizational view of your study startup, as well as the very deep study level view would be crucial to make an effective proactive plan for the study startup. And then these plans are, shared with the stakeholders. People have visibility into what's coming down the pike, what is assigned to them individually and other team members, and provides that transparency everybody needs, and puts the person responsible for a startup also really in charge, rather than just for the namesake. Yes, you're responsible for a startup.
Yeah, and actually, I think that ties right into the next point too, in terms of the roles and responsibilities behind it. So the workflow part of it is one thing, but understanding, the people part of it, that who's involved and who needs to be involved when, not only in terms of kind of how you're managing things day to day, but in terms of resource plans. So when you're thinking about hiring, what FTE do you need? Are you a site that has pretty steady workflow, or do you have months of 2 studies and months of 15 studies, and what does that look like in terms of roles and responsibilities? Do you have individuals that can do kind of multiple different areas? So maybe, to help kind of with the ebb and flow of work, do you have individuals that can jump into different areas? Do you have very specialized niche roles where they're kind of only doing certain parts of it, and you're creating a bottleneck because maybe your coverage analysis person is very efficient, but the budget person is behind because sponsors are being unresponsive, and so there's a bottleneck in terms of the backlog that you're creating there. and sort of what does that look like in terms of the process, and trying to work through how to provide support in those kinds of situations. Escalation plan. So I've been kind of talking about that, but I think the key here is, we work with sites that require, or different sites require different things, right? In terms of, do you have clinical team sign off? Do you have, if something isn't being agreed upon in the contract, and you're gotten to the point of your fallback language and it's still not agreed upon, who needs to make that decision? What does that look like? Again, just in terms of the documenting and the mapping out and the being thoughtful of, is it a situation where some of the decisions that are currently being escalated can actually be done more upfront in the process, so it doesn't have to go through that additional steps, versus when is that actually truly necessary for your site in terms of, trying to provide protections for your site whilst not slowing things down if you don't need to.
Great points. And tying into the assigned roles and responsibilities, the systems you're using, they may be manual right now. You may reevaluate systems like TrialConnx that can help you manage your whole plan and the workload that's given to individual team members. But it helps both the activation manager or the person responsible for it to see who's accountable for what, and also to be able to pinpoint, as Nicole said, where are the inefficiencies or bottlenecks. Maybe the same activity was to be done by the budget negotiator and then the contract specialist, and then it got delayed or got stuck as the contract specialist was working on it. But how do you get visibility into that entire process? That's of course possible with the right systems in place, rather than you manually tracing the whole workflow. You're chasing people or trying to find out where things are in different ways, rather than with click of a button, let me see where things are at this point. And for team members, it's even better because they want to be able to see what they are responsible for when something is due, where they may be delayed, and who do they need to reach out to if they have any issues.
Yeah, and I'll just go off that and say that, how vital the technology part is for the process management, and how, if you are a really busy site that has a lot going on, it's hard to imagine not having something like that to support it. Like you're saying, as an individual contributor, in terms of what studies do I have going on and where are they, and have I followed up with this study lately, or not kind of losing track of things, but definitely from the oversight perspective as well. I think, something to think about process wise there is, of course, everyone's different. So busy for one person might look different than busy from another person, and just having a sense of sort of what's individual's capacity, and maybe where is there an opportunity to provide training, or where are you kind of having issues, kind of looking at it at a closer level, on an individual level versus kind of overall. So just kind of going back to the resource and staffing part of things. Oops, sorry.
Next slide.
There we go. So yeah, so actually we're gonna switch here. So we're going to the work queue part of things. So in terms of the, managing what we were just talking about, managing the constant stream of studies always coming in, trying to make sure that you're doing that efficiency, that things aren't getting backed up in the process, especially if you have multiple negotiations going on. That's where it can get really complicated, to try to, keep up with things, to make sure that things are moving through the process. Just to focus on one process aspect here with the negotiations, I think, for me, a couple of key things here is, one, setting expectations, going back to the point that I was alluding to earlier about, we are, as a site, looking to finalize the budget and contract in 30 days. If we don't hear back from you in 3 days, we're going to be following up again. Sharing that information so that they understand on their end sort of, what your kind of path forward looks like. And the other part of that too, in terms of clearing the work queue, is, giving all the documentation that you can upfront in terms of the justification, and making sure that your team knows sort of what you have available for that justification for all the different types of trials and, items that they might be encountering, and how they can best equip themselves to try to deal with the studies in a timely manner, so that you're not creating more backlog just because you run into some slow situations where communication isn't great and things start to get backed up from there.
Yeah, and piggybacking off of that, with the the plan in place and the systems in place, now the resources, of course, have more visibility into what's coming down the pike, where they're delayed, and so on. But if needed, as they pass the work, they should be able to pass the baton to the next person doing the work as well. So a person sitting in contracting need not get overwhelmed with something that's not even doable right now because another team member is working on it. So it doesn't really help if it appears in their work queue unless the work is finished by the person or the team members who are completing a certain aspect of it. And having that kind of control into now it's time to give it to somebody else and it appears in their work queue will be very, very important, again, to help people self organize and also they don't get overwhelmed with, yes, there are so many things going on, which one should I really work on it first? And then as you're going through resources, some activities are done by one person, some may be done by 10. You should be able to see the whole transition of, and that comes more to the oversight as well. You should be able to see the transition of when did we start something, how long did it take to do certain part of the activity, and where are the delays, or where did it take us longest as we completed a certain particular startup activity.
Yeah, and it actually kind of going off one of the points that you made in terms of the communication side of things. So the handoff part of things. I know some sites are fortunate to have a lot of people, and they'll have kind of very specialized. This person does CA only, this person only does the budget, this person only does the contract, and so on. Which can be great in terms of having experts, but I think one of the key things there is the communication in terms of, like you said, the handoff part of things. So you're not having items sit. If it is someone separate doing the CA and someone separate doing the budget, when does the budget person know that they can start to move forward because they have everything accounted for in the CA? Or are you waiting for approval of the CA and your site at least moves forward with a draft CA once it's mostly done, so you're not impeding that progress? And what does that look like? And in terms of not only between the different like services and the potential silos that can exist there, but like you said, if it's a team of people that do the budgets and you're kind of waiting on that, how does that team know? What does that look like in terms of saying this one's ready for someone to grab, and to make sure that's not slowed down with that? Or if it's not quite a team, but maybe it's an individual and they're out of the office, maybe suddenly out of the office. Do you have the necessary information for someone else to be able to jump into a negotiation and know where it's at without having to kind of go back to the sponsor and say, we're not quite sure where the last email is. Can you help us with the status of this? Because of course, especially if you're on round 3, if you don't have the centralized documents and you don't have good communication between the teams, I have a centralized email box as a consideration. In addition to the tool kind of things, some mechanism of standardized communication where everyone knows where the key information is in terms of the status of things and can jump in. And again, you're not slowed down if someone is suddenly out of the office or you're kind of having to work through those considerations.
No, great points. And tying in with that, communication channels are there, but weaving them in with the startup process is the real key here. Where can you centrally find everything related to any activity, whether it's budget negotiation, contract, any regulatory activity, and so on? You could have maybe common inboxes, but then also you're going through your email process rather than your one plan that you're working off of, and then you can go in and see, I'm waiting for this particular approval. Where are the things and where are the different communication messages that went back and forth? And where do I jump in? Somebody's not available, somebody's overloaded, got overbooked with something else, nobody else can fill in. Again, I bring back to the people dependency point. You're still waiting on people. You're still, trying to get information from others because it's hard to put the entire communication workflow together if it's not at a central place. And then with that, you also need some sort of reminders, a way to say, yes, I sent it to this person, let me follow up in 3 days. You could use your Outlook and other things also. But again, having it at one place really helps out with getting updates on what's assigned to you, where were you tagged, maybe somebody's waiting on you for some information, and you're replying back and forth at one place. Anybody can go in and see, no matter what happened, both externally, internally, you have beginning to end of that process available at one particular place.
Yeah, yeah, I do think it's key to mention sort of the centralized location part of this, because I think in research we've all probably been there in some point where you're trying to do it all through Outlook, and you have that reminder flagged of like, oh, I got to chase this one down soon, but then I got to chase that one down soon, and it just dealing with a really busy industry where you're constantly doing that follow up. Is that really the most efficient way to do it, or does something kind of slip to the wayside, or like you said, and then if someone else needs to jump in and help because someone's drowning, can you actually do that? I think in some ways that probably ties to the next point, but I'm going to focus on a slightly different aspect of the centralized command center. So one other consideration that I wanted to throw out here as it relates to kind of how we work with sites with train and build. A lot of sites will come to us for help because they're going from decentralized process to centralized process. Because I think this is a really good example of where these pain points and considerations kind of exist in general, but a point that it's sort of like sites are forced to reckon with this in some ways is when they're trying to take different parties that might be doing things entirely different, in some cases for good reason, in some cases maybe not, and trying to bring it into one centralized process where everything's kind of through an individual or through a set team now, through you have to kind of work through what does our workflow look like, what do we have to do in terms of the approvals, what are we doing for our budgets now. There's but oncology is a perfect example of most sites. Oncology kind of lives on their own island. And there might not be a lot of conversation right now currently between the central office, if there's a central office, and these different departments. And, there might be good best practices on both sides, and they're not kind of talking to each other right now. So just kind of thinking through that aspect of things in terms of, one, if you are going through that process of trying to centralize, taking that opportunity to do some of these actions because you're kind of forced into it in some ways in terms of getting the key stakeholders involved, having good communication, working on documenting your processes and your policies and all of that. But even if you're not working through that process, if you are decentralized and you're going to stay that way, just at least potentially having that conversations with the different areas of your institutions to see, in terms of best practices or where you could maybe learn from each other or find your counterpart. I've definitely worked with sites where a counterpart that's in a different department, they don't even know each other or they don't even know each other's names, but they work at the same institution. And for a sponsor, they're not necessarily thinking of the different departments as totally separate in the same way that the site might not be. So just kind of bring that up in terms of the potential opportunities that exist with that.
Yeah, and my recommendation usually is keep it as centralized as possible. So whether it's one central office managing the startup for every type of research that you're doing, or they themselves are coordinating with the assigned maybe activation manager. That's a relatively newer role that's come up, somebody taking that responsibility from end to end of that study as it's getting started, and then work with the individual contributors and so on. But centralizing the whole effort actually helps in few ways. One is, of course, you're trying to do things in a certain manner, and that certain manner is then measurable by the tools you use, or you're tracking how this office is really performing the whole startup. Now, when you bring in the standardization and process improvements, you're again applying it as a whole rather than, again, let's try to fix this department versus that department for certain areas. Now, what would be a visual command center? So there is a centralized office or a centralized person as they're going through through the startup process. What we envision using tools, you could have a command center for your study. And if you, Nicole, can move to the next slide. something like this may not be super clear right now, but if you watch through the different activities of the startup process, now this person has a clear view of where things are, what's overdue, where exactly a certain step is in during the startup process, and much more. Now, if this person goes in and see what went through as they went through the budget negotiation, they have a clear way to get in and let me see who talked to which department and where is the holdup and where are they still waiting on, whether it's feedback or any input. Yeah, that's a fun image. Before we talk about what could be effective collaboration, let's look at what's the current state of collaboration and communication. And like I mentioned earlier, that there are several tools. There are more tools than people need. You talk about multiple spreadsheets and smart sheets and your email notifications, your messages, text messages, Slack messages, you name it, and there's a lot more. And then the endless meetings. There are still decisions made in meetings that again go back somewhere on the spreadsheets and so on. But it still appears like there is a disconnect between multiple stakeholders, and you're still relying on people to get the most recent update or the information that you need.
So process-wise, in terms of preferred state, I'm sure a lot of this probably goes without saying. I don't know that anyone's striving for more meetings, for example, but like Sonia was saying, in terms of having, a tool or something that's agreed upon, that's central, that everyone can access, I think that really that's kind of the key for a lot of this. And then again, like I can't stress enough the documentation part of it. The more that you have available to your team, and not just available to your team, but in a useful way, I think is the other thing that I'll throw into that of not having inundating them with tons of over information. There should, of course, still be a training aspect to this, but that making sure that they have those key pieces of information, key ways of checking that they're doing things in a thorough way, that they're um, following the process, that the handoffs are going well, that they're only getting approvals when it's required, and they understand what that is, and that they can kind of make sure that they're able to support each other in a thoughtful way.
Great points. And preferred state from the technology standpoint is what you're looking at, a clear view for all stakeholders in terms of where things are, whether they are external teams you're working with, your internal teams, individual contributors, and even the leadership team. The list goes on in terms of different stakeholders for your startup process, but they can all benefit from a centralized location, a centralized mode of communication. Like I mentioned, you have a full view of the startup process, where things are, how many resources completed a certain activities, what are the key transition points, what is the communication that's going back and forth, and rather than sitting in different forms of communication that we were talking about, having it at central place that even generates notifications as necessary becomes super helpful. And such a state then reduces the dependency on people being there for you to move forward. So people are out of office, they're sick, or you need a resource backup. If you have everything at one place, you're really less dependent on the human touch points here. And of course, there are a lot of meetings that can be reduced, that you don't need to attend if you can get your updates from a system, rather than again, let me listen in a 1 hour meeting and let me see what I'm supposed to do next because I've learned that these 5 things are completed or these 2 things are upcoming now. Here is an example. Actually, we should have moved to it. Now that looks like a communication thread, and we just took example of one contract review here. It could be any activity during the startup process, but having that one thread of communication where multiple team members could be tagged, internal, external, the documentation is uploaded and exchanged. There's a full audit trail of what happened at what time. You're keeping things centrally here, tied in with your startup process rather than trying to find everything that can match with what you're working on.
Okay. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here now and kind of talk about well, how do you know you're doing well? So let's, we talked about kind of the issues in terms of the bottlenecks, some things to consider in terms of process and technology that can hopefully help address and illuminate where there are issues so you can address the issues. But this is sort of well, what does that look like? What are we measuring ourselves against? How do we know that we're doing a good job? So, of course, in startup, the name of the game is time. So the big one is when, how long until you're going from when you're selected to when you're activated. But a consideration that I'll bring up there is, it's helpful to have that understanding of the overall time. So you have that knowledge, but where you're more likely to be able to actually take action and address issues, if there are issues, is breaking that down further. Which is where, for us, we use the tool to kind of really be able to have that insight. Data is knowledge, of course. So being able to look at very specifically, the coverage analysis is taking this much time. Between the coverage analysis end date and the budget start date is this much time. Our budget negotiations is taking, X, and so on and so forth, to really be able to see sort of where is the opportunity to look at the process further, to have further conversations, to dig in and say, is there something process wise we need to change? Is there something resource wise we need to change? Is there, something in the workflows and the approvals? And even, I would say, even a step further beyond that. So looking at each kind of process, but then you can kind of break it down different ways. So maybe it's a specific department. So maybe one of your departments is having a much harder time with contract negotiations because it's a resource issue, or maybe it's a training issue and they're not quite as efficient as someone else, and you could bring in the other person for training. This could even be on a sponsor level. So when you're kind of looking at your activation timelines or maybe your budget negotiations, is there one notorious sponsor where this is really an issue and really impeding your ability to clear the queue to where you're getting the backup of studies, and maybe it's a sponsor that you work with all the time, and something like a master agreement might make sense. So again, kind of really diving into the different areas of the activation process and the different kind of categories within that, to be able to understand sort of where these opportunities exist and where your site is currently being slowed down in the process. Of course, there's the financial side of things. So in terms of the per patient profitability, your startup fees, are you getting paid on the back end? If you're working with vendors, are they covering their costs? Kind of thinking through that part of things. Contract protections. Billing issues is a little bit harder to see because that's where, again, good communication and process review is really key in terms of does the front end coverage analysis person understand on the back end when you have a denial? Are you kind of working through that? Are you thinking through their different payers for insurance and the potential issues there, and incorporating policies upfront as a result of that? And then just in terms of quality, I think this is the hardest part of this, is how do we know that we're doing well beyond the areas where you can get concrete data metric kind of information. So, do you have someone at your site that serves as an expert that's doing kind of quality checks? I think, again, for train and build, this is something that we talk to sites about a lot, in terms of you bring in someone and maybe they have a lot of great experience and it seems like they're doing well, but even that person themselves might have a bit of hesitation of, in terms of, do I really understand? Maybe I've done cardiac studies, but I haven't done CAR T, and do I know all the considerations there? And do I know for my institution the considerations in terms of logistics, billing, our payers, our policies, things like that? And this is where I think a lot of times, partnering with someone can really be helpful in terms of having someone that has broader knowledge of industry best practices. How are other sites doing this? What are kind of the latest trends? Because, in terms of quality and clinical research, it's hard in general, but things change constantly. Medical regulations change constantly, or Medicare regulations change constantly. There's always new therapeutic products being introduced. So there's a lot to try to keep up with in terms of measuring yourself.
Yeah, and I'll bring back to what technology can do to help with this whole metrics tracking. What you can see is organizational level metrics, and you can track metrics at organization level or individual study level as well. And at organizational level, now you can see how well are we doing. And we took example of these two particular activities here, your budget negotiation and initial contract to study level documents. There is a time period that's selected. Now you can see how did you do this year and how do you compare it to last year. And unless you are collecting data at every point manually, it's hard to produce. Let me get information, let me get metrics from point A to point B, and I could change my point A to point B at any time to understand how we are doing. And Nicole brought up a great point. How do you know which sponsor takes longer to work with, and where do I need to improve? Unless you're tracking a multifaceted metrics, that's hard to get to it. That I take 20 days to work with Pfizer, but 10 days to work with Lilly, just as an example. And what do I need to do to work with individual sponsors, and where can I protect myself as well? Now, all of this is produced automatically with people just performing their day-to-day activities or saying, yes, I'm done with this, it's moving on, there is progress, or it's on hold. And something like this can be produced with a click of a button automatically, not really maintaining anything manually as you go along. But at organization level, and next slide, I think we have a study level metrics indication as well. Now, at organization level, you want to see what's your average, what's your median or maximum. But at study level, you might want to see when did I start this study? How long did it take for the study to get through from your initial contact to the now the study is activated? What's the in progress? I have started 30 days ago, I'm still not done. And a lot of other areas that can help you gauge how you are doing at individual study level, whether it comes to which activities are completed, which activities were completed by these three individuals, and I took 10 days to finish one part of it, and the 10 days other person finished, and so on. So even at the study level, you can get to resource level turnaround times as well, and see if you need any additional help. Maybe the resources are overloaded, or this is where you need to bring in additional efficiencies because a certain sliver of that activity took longer than the whole activity.
And then just kind of a note here in terms of the ongoing considerations. Like I said, a lot of this stuff is not only the initial legwork, but the maintenance part of it. And here, just in terms of, internal auditing or providing some means of kind of continuously monitoring yourself and allowing for corrective actions if needed, or if you need to update your processes, just kind of throwing that into the conversation as well.
Yeah, and this ties down to what we've been talking about. How do you identify your bottlenecks? That's the biggest ongoing consideration. Where do I need to push more? Where do I need to address a certain issue so things can be moved forward? How do I reduce timelines for a certain area of the startup process? And that's only possible if you are collecting that much data, and better it is if it's automated than anybody again updating 10 spreadsheets to produce something like this.
Okay. One other note here that just kind of wanted to talk about just briefly is just in terms of course, right now, there's a lot of uncertainty in the industry with NIH cuts, and just, sites are kind of looking for maximizing revenue kind of as much as possible. So just wanted to bring that into the conversation in terms of kind of thinking through that in an end-to-end way as well, not only startup, but beyond, in terms of, starting with the coverage analysis as your initial means of protecting your site to make sure you're not having issues with denials, to make sure that you are uncovering items that aren't included in the sponsored budget, using the CA to build the budget, costs in terms of their budget, taking that time to kind of review your costs, your admin fees. Have you looked at your admin fees recently and done an update kind of based on the cost of today, to try to really think through how do you maximize, the revenue in your existing studies, sort of, what's within your control and that you can actually kind of have some impact on. And just a note here about budget justification, have you gone through that exercise of really making sure you have strong documentation so that you are getting your fees covered, and hopefully, in a timely manner. And then working towards the back end in terms of denials, are you doing a first patient and claims review? And then in terms of AR, just kind of really spending the time there, whether you're using Excel or CTMS, and being kind of making sure you're putting dedicated resources into making sure you're getting paid, which you should be getting paid.
Yeah, and with the uncertain times, I think it's even more important to get more efficient or bring in more process efficiencies, and teams are required to do more and more with less. You're expected to increase capacity without really increasing capacity also. So how are you going to succeed? It may sound counterintuitive, oh, we have budget cuts and why should we invest in technology? But then you have budget cuts, you have less people, you need better ways of doing things than taking longer to do things and delaying the whole process. So, of course, bringing in technology will be extremely helpful to streamline the whole process and do things even better in these tough times.
All right. So to start to wrap it up here, just some notes in terms of the staffing training side of things that we've been talking about. And again, kind of train and build and how we're supporting sites today. A lot of this comes down to, site specific training. So not just knowing how to do something in general, but knowing how to do it for your site and giving that individual the right resources to be able to be successful in the role, and, kind of thinking through all aspects of that. So, as a budget person, if that's what I've done, kind of coming in, do I understand how to read the coverage analysis and incorporate that information into my budget as an example? So just kind of bringing back the considerations, because of course the people again makes the difference in this process.
Yeah, and I'll only add that you set your team for success with the standardized processes, and of course enable them with the technology or the tools you provide them to do. They need to be able to self-organize, perform better, and even figure out where do they need help or where do they need to ask for help. And same for the leadership. You're able to see things better if things are tracked and traced at central place. You have more transparency, and you're able to find out how can I help my team members. Again, is there anything I can do in addition to technology? Do I look for external resources, external help? There is more that you can do once you have visibility of the entire process.
Okay. So just a few final notes. So just I think kind of the through line here is really talking about the tools and the documentation and setting up your team for success. And with that comes looking at your initial kind of baseline where you're at today. What are your goals? And putting the right things in place to try to invest the time now for the long term benefit. Quick wins, so just in terms of increasing transparency, the proactive planning, trying to centralize your tracking, your key documents. With both of these, vendor support might make sense for your institution depending on kind of where you are and the resources that you have available. And then just kind of the more time intensive long-term items, I think the biggest thing is identifying the bottlenecks in terms of then trying to figure out what the solutions might be or where there are these opportunities for improvement, and where you can really use the data to help inform decisions in terms of making process changes or measuring success. Kind of what are we at today and where are we looking at the issues to be able to measure ourselves in the future to see where we've done well.
Great. Nicole, I do see a couple of questions, and I think
Okay.
some we've already addressed, but where does someone begin when trying to improve their site's startup process? And I think that ties in with the last slide as well.
Yeah. Where to begin? I mean, yeah, I think there's a couple different areas that are key to look at, and we just talked about those in terms of having the conversations about the documents and the tools and the resources. But it's a little bit, of course, different for every site in terms of where the need might be. But that's kind of my quickest answer to that is: do you have the right people? Do they have the right information? Do they have the right tools? And kind of have you taken this time to examine your process to make sure that you're successful?
Wonderful. And we've pretty much reached the end. I can just take one question, which is how do you know you're doing well? I think the best way is to start with a baseline. Do you have a baseline or not? how do you perform right now in terms of individual startup process, individual activities in the startup process. And then as you establish the baseline, then you see, do you want to improve any of those certain areas? And that's the information you'll use for your ongoing monitoring as well. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just second that, and that, in terms of the technology, and again, we do use TrialConnx here, and having that insight in terms of the very detailed data, I think is vital in terms of being able to fully examine all of that. All right, well, with that, we're somehow already at the hour. We have some contact information here. I'll leave this up for a couple seconds for, this is for Elevate. You can go to our website, of course, to contact us that way as well. Sonia, thank you for doing this webinar with us. It was great to have this opportunity to collaborate and get your expertise on the technology side of things. And everyone else, thank you very much for joining today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Nicole. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks. Have a good rest of your